Hi, everyone. And I want to extend a welcome to Ashoka's global community that's listening in, as well as people from the Coworker community. Thank you for joining us for this installment of Welcome Change, which is Ashoka's conversation series about what's working and what's next. Now, we think of it as a kind of a news hour where you get to hear directly from an Ashoka Fellow on a subject that's highly relevant to the country and the world right now. I'm Michael Zakaris, Director of Ashoka United States. Today, we're joined by Michelle Miller, who's the co-founder of Coworker.org, a laboratory for workers in the 21st century to experiment with power building strategies and win meaningful changes in their workplaces. As is always the case, Michelle and I will chat together for about 20 minutes, and then we'll address questions that any of you can submit during the conversation via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. So let's just jump right in. Michelle, good to have you here. When you talk about your work, Michelle, the word power comes up a lot. Building power, shifting power, leveraging power. So as a way to set the context, maybe you could give us all a very brief lesson in the history of worker power in this country and where workers find themselves now in the third decade of the 21st century.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael, and thanks to Ashoka for having me here today. I will try to give a brief history of worker power. So when we talk about power, we really talk about the ability for people in a workplace to shape the conditions under which they work, and that any time that you are engaged with someone who potentially has more power than you are in a negotiation about what that might look like. And over the course of the past few centuries in this country, the models for people to have the ability to shape their workplaces and their working conditions and the economy have shifted over time, but it has always been this kind of negotiation between employees and employers, depending on the context. And so, you know, in the 19th century, as we moved from an agricultural economy that was heavily built on slavery and no mechanism for people to have power over their working conditions into an industrial economy, people starting to work in factories, people starting to work outside of the home. There were moments when people wanted to start thinking about how they are trading their labor for a share of the profit that's generated by their employer, and started to build things like guilds and collectives and fraternal orders in order to both negotiate for what they feel they deserve for their labor and also take care of one another. So much of the history of labor is not just about what happens inside of the workplace, but about the ways we create economic structures, democratic economic structures that allow us to take care of one another and share our resources more broadly. So in the 19th century, we saw the Knights of Labor, we saw other kinds of informal organizations built by workers. We saw that going up and through the progressive era, and as we were thinking about negotiations around what the economy was for and how we reallocated resources to ensure that people had enough and had housing and had health and safety codes inside their workplaces. The Triangle Shirt Waste Factory fire resulted in 20 different regulations that were designed to take care of workers. And all of this kind of added up to the National Labor Relations Act of the 1930s, which was really built upon an industrial factory model of negotiating around working conditions and created trade unions. Since then, there was a boom in trade union membership for a short period of time in the 20th century. That model of the National Labor Relations Act is really predicated on you having an employer and being able to negotiate with that employer. And what we've seen over the past 40 years is a real disaggregation of the workplace and working conditions, where it's much more difficult to for a worker to negotiate with a single employer. People are subcontracted, people are independent, people are working in the gig economy. And so what we are trying to do is figure out, in this new context of disaggregated work, how are people negotiating for power and how are people experimenting with how that is shaped so that they can start to reimagine what their working conditions could look like in the 21st century.
Thank you for that, a quick history lesson. and so not everyone here is necessarily very familiar with Coworker.org. So maybe you can just give them a sense briefly of what it is and maybe from the standpoint of an hourly worker, say a barista at Starbucks, or perhaps a kind of gig economy worker, or someone who's doing, you know, consulting?
Yeah, so most simply, Coworker supports people who are organizing to shift power in their workplaces. And we do this in a couple of different ways. We do it through digital campaigning on our website. We have a website that's accessible to anybody, that is designed so that somebody who has no experience in workplace organizing and advocacy can get on and start a campaign about something they care about and use the internet to find their coworkers. So your example of Starbucks baristas, that's our largest and most active network. These are baristas for the past 7 years who have been running campaigns around wages, dress code policies, scheduling concerns, and they use their digital network to raise these concerns to one another and campaign for those changes. More recently, we have started building out a program around training and facilitation, because what we're seeing is that there are some groups of people who are a little further along and want the support around building collective leadership and thinking about like how you actually work with your employer to change norms in your workplace, and also some research and policy around addressing the existing barriers to organizing and freedom of association. And all of these things are really in service of this theory that we have, that the more people that have a direct, positive, and generative experience with organizing and with getting together with their coworkers and seeing the things in their workplaces that they know can change and finding ways to change them, the stronger the labor movement is, and the more people we have actively participating in shaping the economy at large.
Mm. And in a way, you're saying that there's kind of an organizing muscle that needs to be built and practiced, and otherwise it's, you know, it kind of atrophies, which is part of the story of the last 40 years of labor in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, this isn't something that's taught in schools. This isn't something that we're told we can do. It's really something that people have to experience. And you have to learn how to engage in collective decision making. You have to learn how to identify what the actual problem is that you're experiencing in your workplace, to name it, and to actually like build power around changing it. And what we've seen, I think some of the most promising organizing we've seen is in the gig sector, which is almost a wholly new sector that has come about in the past 10 years. And the inventiveness and imagination of those workers building online spaces where they're talking to one another, identifying like the multi-layered issues around surveillance and data collection and standard working conditions, and then coming together to actually try and shift those conditions, have been just absolutely remarkable.
And you know, one of the phenomena in our economy, despite sort of the decentralizing and democratic promise of technology, has actually been the opposite. It's been hyper consolidation. It's been the big five, you know, the Apples and the Amazons, which in general, not necessarily good for workers, not good for small businesses. But it sounds like in this case, you really are leveraging the connecting power, including across sectors, across, you know, thousands of miles, to build decentralized power.
That is exactly what we are trying to do. And we, because we have been using the internet and popular digital tools since our inception for that kind of connective work, we are also paying a lot of attention to the way that the concentration of power by the big five has potentially like limiting impacts on people's ability to continue to use those tools to organize. So we kind of look at it in two ways and see ourselves as active participants and informing, you know, the way in which so many of these platforms rely on surveillance. So many of these companies own the tools that their own workers are using in order to try and organize. It's a really complicated space. But what we see workers doing with these tools is something that demonstrates the promise of a new kind of internet that is much less centralized and much less predicated on the extraction of data and surveillance.
So the pandemic, you know, the last 18 months, of course, has consumed our lives. In addition to being a deadly public health crisis was a wrecking ball for our economy, and especially for wage workers. But it was also an important moment for thinking about what the future of the labor movement will be. And it sounds like it was an important moment for Coworker.org in particular. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, so Coworker's primary user base has always been people in frontline jobs, retail, food service, logistics. And so we had seen a kind of uptick already in organizing over the past couple of years, but when the pandemic hit, there was just a surge of campaigns on the platform led by workers in frontline industries, really naming the key issues that were going to go on to impact frontline workers for the next 18 months. So hazard pay, PPE, health and safety concerns in general. And, you know, in places like grocery, within a week, I think we had a campaign at every single national grocery chain. Within a week of the shutdown, every single national grocery chain calling for hazard pay. And I think that now when we look back, we kind of think of terms like hazard pay or concepts like this as just like natural responses to what happened during the pandemic. But the truth is that these workers organized for those things, and they are the ones who identified that need and brought it to public attention and brought it to the attention of their employers. And that was organizing. Like, that is what organizing work does, is it makes a need visible and rallies people around to ensure that people actually have that need met. So in that way, it was an incredible moment. It was a moment for many people to see that they had the potential to have power inside their workplaces. But what we've also seen is that there is an inextricable link between rising COVID rates and low wage frontline work, specifically in communities of color. So like researchers at the Urban Institute found that more than half of Black, Latinx, and Native American workers held jobs that had to be done in person. And when you layer that with the rates of COVID in those communities being higher than other populations, you can see the ways in which our workplaces and the quality of the work that we're able to do are directly related to our health and literally to our ability to survive. And I hope that one of the things that what the pandemic was able to lay bare was the ways in which these things are connected, and the necessity of these workers in particular to have the ability to assert their needs and to ensure that they are able to stay safe while they're doing their work.
And you know, part of the conversation now, as we start to emerge on the other side of this pandemic, is sort of what does it look like to return to normal or not to return to normal, right? This idea of a new normal. And so I'm wondering whether you think this will, will this be sustained? The surge in organizing, will it be sustained? What is necessary to sustain it, and our companies and leadership in companies, including CEOs, responding in the right way to this, and in order to help sustain these efforts.
I think it can be sustained. I mean, what we're seeing, and why the reason why we're sort of investing a lot in our training and facilitation work is that we're seeing people who kind of came together during the early days of the pandemic and want to continue to do their work inside their industries or inside their companies in deeper, longer term ways. And in the context of, the failure in this country around the economy did not just happen inside of workplaces, it happened in all of the other infrastructure that kind of holds us up and makes it possible for us to survive. So we saw, the unemployment system, the failures of the unemployment insurance system in this country laid bare. We saw the problems that are central to childcare provision and healthcare provision laid bare, like so much. And so I think that for a lot of people, engaging in starting that workplace organizing and thinking about what's going on in their workplace also kind of opens up a way of thinking more broadly about what is the economy for, and what are we trying to do to shift and shape the economy, which really gets us into democracy questions, like who has a voice in this country, how do we organize ourselves around having that voice, and how do we start to build structures so that more people, and specifically working class communities of color have access to systems of power so that we can reshape them. And I do think that some employers are trying to respond to these shifts. It is going to require a different kind of workplace that actually is structured to take seriously the concerns and demands of the workers that work inside of it. And you know, there is about a 40-year tradition of conventional wisdom that says if you run a company, your primary purpose is to ensure profit, and labor gets in the way of your profit. So you know, like, you have to make a choice between the two. I think that we can get to a place where instead we're actually thinking about that as not a zero-sum game, but that it is critically important to be listening to and providing for democratic controls of a workplace by the people who actually work in it.
And are there examples or of you know, ownership and corporate leadership embracing this in a more open way, or what, you know, if someone's listening that is you know, that is in corporate leadership, what might they do, and is Coworker also a resource for them to sort of make this less of an adversarial relationship, less of a zero-sum game?
I think that, you know, there's one very simple thing to do, which is to envision when people are in a workplace and they're coming together and they're running these campaigns, or they're kind of making their wishes known. It is an active investment in your workplace. It is a way of saying, like, I want to make this better. I have ideas about how this could change, and it doesn't have to be regarded as an attack or something to be squashed down, but actually as like a learning opportunity. Like, what I think that people in C-suite positions or CEO positions have an opportunity to really regard the people that are doing frontline work inside their companies as experts in what it is like to perform that work every day, and to treat that expertise with the value that it deserves. And that expertise is what is informing the requests that people are making of their employers. You know, like I will say, early in the pandemic, a couple of companies where we have very large networks, REI and Starbucks, listened to their employees and shut down for 6 weeks with pay in response to employee campaigns. And that was, I mean, I think if more employers had actually gone to that level of listening to their employees, that there may have been some lives that would have been saved by that choice, instead of trying to like sort of skirt around opening or closing or sort of halfway measures.
Yeah, that's a significant outcome, 6 months. Yeah. One of the conversations, you know, as we again kind of sort of emerged from the pandemic, that we're hearing quite frequently is about, at least in the US, but probably elsewhere, is one of labor shortages, that there aren't enough people to work. So, you know, companies of the varying sizes are reducing hours or even shutting down. Some attribute this, although I'll say without much compelling evidence, to you know, unemployment benefits that are too generous. Others to the fact that wages are too low. I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you explain what's going on right now and what we should learn from it?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you about being very careful about this conversation, because I do think it has been successfully used in about 25 states to reduce access to unemployment insurance benefits, which again is an abysmal system as it is, that does not provide enough for people who pay into it. But you know, there's a complex calculus going on for people around returning to work. Childcare, the ability to provide childcare is still not up to what it was in pre-pandemic levels. So are you going to go back to these jobs if you don't have anyone to take care of your children? Many workers, we heard all the time from workers who were really disappointed in the regard that their employers showed for their health and safety. And so people are making a decision. You know, line cooks had a 60% increase in mortality associated with the pandemic. It was the #1 sector of people who were impacted by the pandemic. They are making life and death decisions about whether or not they're going back to work. And then I do think that there is, a role, something to be said about just human dignity. Like, if people have an opportunity to choose not to be in a place where often low wage jobs are places where people are discriminated against, where they are yelled at, certainly in the context of mask mandates and the political furor over that issue, people in frontline jobs have been much more vulnerable to those kinds of attacks. And so, like, it's not a matter of whether unemployment benefits are too generous or whether we should be paying people more or not. It is also a matter of whether or not you actually have some kind of voice and power and dignity in the work that you're performing. And I think you could look at the Amazon warehouses where they pay $15 an hour and people still are organizing there. It's not because of money. It is because they are highly surveilled. They are forced to meet productivity goals that don't make any sense. They are not able to go to the bathroom. Like, there are multiple pressures on workers right now that are making work in a nearly indigent place.
Well, and since you raised that, I'll turn to a question from someone listening who brings up the reports within Amazon warehouses of the use of AI to monitor, track, fire people with no notice. Walmart moving in this direction, apparently, with the use of AI to gauge worker performance. Are you working with big warehouse employees like that? What advice would you have for them, for employees who may have less face-to-face interaction with their bosses and less of an ability to defend or advocate for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have two things to say about this. One, again, to point to what gig workers have been able to do, who are also often have their entire work day controlled by algorithms. Like, there is a lot that workers can do to start to organize themselves around in these kinds of workplaces. And there's a lot of inspiration to draw from the Gig Workers Collective, who's been doing that. I think the second thing is the use of AI and productivity tracking and algorithms inside the workplace is a significant structural problem for workers. And it's something that we've actually paid quite a bit of attention to at Coworker. We are releasing a report at the end of September where we tracked over 600 workplace software products that measure productivity, that measure your biometric health, that measure that surveil you in all kinds of different ways, and are starting to think about what are the federal regulatory levers that actually need to be in place that tell us what technology can and cannot do as it relates to people's ability to work with safety and dignity. And so, like, I think that there is an organizing solution to that, but I also think that there are regulatory solutions that have to be in place. Specifically, as many of these technology products are predicated on data that has been proven to show a bias in favor of white workers over workers of color, and specifically Black workers, and that tend to exacerbate existing racial inequalities inside of workplaces.
That's good. And Michelle, you have some experience working with traditional labor organizing and traditional unions, and I think your family does as well, going back several generations. I'm curious what lessons and strategies have you pulled from labor organizing of the sort of mid-20th century, and in what ways are you trying to really distinguish yourself or set up Coworker differently to meet the needs of a different looking workforce?
I think that one of the most important things that I and we carry from the traditions of the trade union movement is that sense of what solidarity means. The ways and reasons that people come together are actually not just about the very specific bread and butter issues that people are facing in their workplaces, but that we need to create infrastructure for people to join together, to share resources, to have a place to gather, to learn, to believe in their own visions, to build something bigger than themselves. I am extremely moved by union halls and the ways in which when workers in the mid-century got a little bit of money and got a little bit of power, what they did was they created something that they could all share together, which was the hall. And the hall is where they had meetings, and the hall is where they had parties, and the hall is where they made their decisions. And so I think that that tradition of solidarity and togetherness and the beauty of what happens when working people come together is what we carry. What we're trying to do that is a little different is really just say outright, we don't know what the best solution is. We don't think it is embedded only in the National Labor Relations Act or in the models that we've seen before, but that it has got to be a work of invention by people inside their workplaces as the economy is shifting and changing. And that it's possible that there are multiple forms and solutions that are going to be necessary in order to keep up with the changes in the economy, and that one solution in one workplace might not work in another workplace, but that the real intent is building democracy into all parts of our economy.
Mm. And given how crucial those trade unions, were for securing many of the things that we take for granted today, like a 40-hour work week or this thing called the weekend, how is it that the anti-union narrative in this country has been so successful and still seems to persist so deeply?
I love that question because it actually brings us back to the first question that you asked about power. I think that what we tend to regard at this point as a given, as a thing that we take for granted, the 40-hour work week, although many of us are not working 40 hours a week anymore, we're working more. The weekend, health and safety regulations are things that the labor movement actually had to fight really hard to win. And that you have to build power and hold on to power in order to win. It's not that sometimes there are, but generally the shifts that take those things away from people are sort of like a series of decisions on the side of employers and capital that are about maximizing profit that end up sacrificing these social goods that are on the other end. And there has to be an institution, there has to be something that is fighting to hold the line to protect a lot of people that are impacted by those changes. And so I think that so much of what, and labor, things were okay, and labor didn't feel, or labor wasn't able to point to the things that it had won as things that weren't to be expected. I don't know, that was a little loose, but what I mean is that basically, like, people just expected to have those things and had no sense of, also we don't teach labor history in schools, had no sense of what it took to get them.
Interesting, okay. Another question from a listener is about this sort of unique vantage point that you have now with 21st century workers, more people in the gig economy, across sectors, big companies and small. Do you lift the findings and patterns back and share with those who are making labor policies, or is that something that you anticipate doing more of as you continue to grow?
We do try to do quite a bit of that. We've built out a policy and research program in order to do that, and work really closely both with our allies in labor and people at think tanks and policy and academics and people in philanthropy to share what we are hearing from workers every day, and to make sure that the ways in which people describe their experiences at work are embedded in the thinking that goes into how are we developing policies that protect people's ability to organize. We're launching a project now, which is funded by Time's Up, to work with a group of Black women who, many of whom had experiences with the unemployment system over the past year, to do basically a listening collective where they start to describe what their experiences were, and start to think through, like, what are the sets of economic policies that we would like to see that actually address our experiences. And part of the point of that is to lift that up, and ensure that other people hear those perspectives and integrate them into the work that they're doing to shift our unemployment insurance system.
Very interesting. And as you look towards the next 12 months, what are a couple of things that are going to be, the biggest priorities for you and your team? Where will you be putting your energies?
Yeah, we'll be, one is we'll be putting our energy into this work that I just described, because what we also see the seeds of this as really building out what our training and leadership development work may look like, how it is shaped around people's lived experiences and maybe not rooted in whether or not they're ready to run a campaign tomorrow, but actually wanting to sort of build their collective power. We will be always acting as an open door to anybody who wants to run a campaign, to get support, to think about new ways to change their working conditions. And then we will be investing quite a bit of time in this kind of regulatory reform that addresses the way in which AI and software has a specific negative impact on people's ability to engage in freedom of association and to organize and to sort of build out from the paper that we're releasing next September, sorry.
And one last question, Michelle, as you probably know, Ashoka's broad vision is what we call an everyone a changemaker society, right? So it's one where, so-called ordinary citizens, all of us are playing a role and have the confidence and the support to be change makers for the good of all, feel this sense of power and agency. And I'm wondering, is it realistic to get to that place if where we spend most of our waking hours in our workplaces, we feel powerless, or we feel like we are don't really have a seat at the table? I
don't think it's possible to get there without that. I mean, people's most direct experience with power and decision making happens inside of their workplaces. And if people feel that they cannot experience that while they're at work, it's hard to imagine yourself as being able to change things in other broader structures. And so the workplace and the ability to have a democratic voice inside your workplace is a critical component of people being able to see themselves as change makers. And honestly, to have the time and the energy after they're done working to engage in that kind of work. They are inextricably linked.
Thank you for that. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And in closing, I'll invite you to explore the links in the chat and follow Michelle and her team and their work. And of course, follow this Welcome Change series. Next up, we'll have a conversation with two Ashoka Fellows in the US and Europe on the power of procurement and why for many institutions, procurement is where the rubber meets the road on practicing values of care for the planet, care for workers, and more. So yeah, thanks again for joining us. Michelle, always a pleasure to talk to you and hear about what you're doing. And everybody enjoy the rest of your weeks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.